and Sasha Bhatt, who's a British Kashmiri activist. And I think without further ado, when we talk about Kashmir, there are several questions that come to one's mind, and somebody from the audience just circulated, gave me a whole list of things that people want answers to. And that's not unusual. As somebody who originally comes from Kashmir and has been there, including this year, for extended periods of time, it's hard to escape the idea that people say beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. I would say Kashmir lies in the eye of the beholder, because what Kashmir you see, what you think of as who Kashmiris are, and what do you see as the future of that Kashmir depends very much on who's doing the seeing. And in this panel today, I would like us to, since we are analyzing the situation, the contemporary situation, in what is broadly called Kashmir, again, that signifier can refer to different territorial notions for different people, but that there are many different Kashmirs in the imagination of people, and if you wanted to say what is the history of Kashmir and of the Kashmiri people, then you could also have multiple parallel histories, depending on how far back you want to go back in time and say this is where I'm going to start telling that history from. You could go back 1,000 years, you'd have one history. You could go back 500 years, you would have a different history. If you went back, thousands of years, you would start from Buddhism and Hinduism. If you went back 500 years, you would start by talking about Central Asian connections. If you went back to 1846 and the Treaty of Amritsar, you would have a completely different imperial, imbrication in Kashmir's history. People often go back either to 1947, which is another important milestone in that region, in the South Asian subcontinent. But Kashmir's status on 14th or 15th of August 1947 is perhaps not, doesn't give us as many answers as we would like. The other, I guess, starting point of the histories that one could begin from is the late 80s, from 89, from 91, and that gives us a different, more communalized idea of Kashmir. So the question really is, what does Kashmir mean to us? Who are the different kinds of Kashmiris? Because there are people who identify as Kashmiris, and other Kashmiris would say, no, they're not really Kashmiris. And that is very much true, not just on one or the other side of the line of control. It's also true for within the regions, how people see each other, how people see those who have a different lifestyle or a different religion, what sort of Kashmiris they are. The other, I guess, open question, and I'm going to, make a few remarks and then open up the panel and ask our esteemed panel to speak, is we have to reflect on the idea of what supporting the cause of Kashmir means in India and what it means in Pakistan. And that's actually really interesting, because if you speak for Kashmiri rights in India, then it further matters whether you are speaking for Kashmiri Muslims, whether you are speaking for Kashmiri Hindus. And increasingly, in the very communal, polarized Hindutva India that we see now, that is a big question. Likewise, I have interacted with many people from Pakistan who are Pakistanis, not Kashmiris, but Pakistanis, who would say, being progressive in Pakistan means that we don't say much about Kashmir, because that gets fed into a communal narrative. So what supporting the cause of Kashmir means in India and Pakistan, as well as the two different discourses around this. One is the discourse of human rights, and we all know about the human rights abuses. If we don't know, we should know about the immense human rights abuses that have been going on for a long time in various parts of Kashmir. But when people talk about human rights abuses, they more often than not refer to the Indian side of Kashmir rather than the Pakistani side. So there's that question of human rights, and then there's the question of self-determination. These two are linked, but not in a very obvious way. And there are very often people would like to speak about human rights, and they do, but then they don't say anything about self-determination. And the self-determination question again takes us back to who is the Kashmiri self? How do we understand the Kashmiri self that needs to determine itself? So a few open questions that I hope our panel will in one way or the other address is what does administration mean and look like, and how is that different from occupation? What does an occupation of a region and of a people mean, and what does it look like? What does Azadi mean? Azadi in Srinagar would probably mean something very different, and Azadi in Azad Jammu and Kashmir has a different resonance. Who is a Kashmiri? This is a question I want to go back to again and again. As well as where is the next generation of Kashmiri leadership going to come from? Numerous people who have for a long time exhausted their lives, speaking up or fighting for the cause of Kashmir, worry about the future. Where is the future of Kashmiri leadership going to come from? And finally, I would like our panelists also at some point to maybe reflect a little bit about the role of gender in occupation, in territoriality, and in possession. Because certainly from my work, it seems to me a very important idea of why nation-states refuse to talk to each other, to have dialogues, why they take up these heavily militarized nationalistic positions which signify a kind of masculinist militarism. We don't negotiate, we control, we don't cede even an inch of territory. We humiliate the people in order to teach them a lesson. So that kind of rhetoric is deeply tied into notions of a kind of toxic masculinity that links up with nationalism. But I think that's enough from me for now. We'll go, I think, in alphabetical order to be as neutral as possible. So, Divyesh, I would like you to first begin, and then I will ask Sasha and then Mr. Khan. So, Divyesh, if you would say a little bit reflect a little bit about all of this, and also say something about maybe the Indian progressive position on the question of Kashmir, because we find that people in India are often, called anti-national for things much less complicated than Kashmir. But on Kashmir, there's the additional label of being seditious, and also say something about the regional geopolitics. I think I will ask each one of you to speak for a few minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, and then you can and then we have a discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, as following from the previous panel, some of you attended it, which was on partition and that part, and we talked of 1947. As Nitasha said that, because there are multiple histories of Kashmir, it depends on who you talk to, and I remember on social media someone sent me a link and some activists saying that, oh, this is essentially a compromised panel, and they were referring to this panel because this sounds like somehow a pro-Pakistani or Pakistani agenda-driven panel. Partly it was because of the problematic description of the event in this. But if you go on website, the description is different, which is more neutral. So there was a problematic one where it said, I think it was a mistake, it said that essentially one part joined Pakistan, another part was occupied. Right? So there was some kind of problem with this, and we changed. The reason I mentioned that on social media, of course, is because the way in which as soon as you start talking of Kashmir, you've got multiple views, competing views, and then you've got name calling. So there was this name calling, social media calling all of us, even though they don't know us, that somehow this is part of a certain kind of conspiracy. Now, and they call themselves JKIs, the Jammu Kashmirites, saying that, oh, Kashmir dominates Jammu Kashmir discourse. So partly that's true, Kashmir does dominate Jammu Kashmir discourse. We'll focus here on broadly both the right to self-determination of people of Jammu and Kashmir, but also Kashmir specifically because most of the human rights abuses have taken place within Kashmir, and specifically Kashmir Valley. Now, the way I see it, of course, I am someone who's not a Kashmiri. I am interested in Kashmir politically, so I could be seen as British, Indian both, Indian progressive. I'll start with that question. In India, you find the Hindu fascists, right, Hindu nationalism, talking about being Islamophobic, they kill Muslims, in beef, they have been atrocious in various ways. They, of course, also hate Christians. But the reality is, there's a difference between secularist Indians and Hindu nationalist Indians, broadly speaking, so they have some similarities, on various issues. But on Kashmir, they stick together. So even the Indian left, which you'd expect to support Kashmir self-determination movement, doesn't support Kashmir self-determination movement. They oppose human rights abuses there, but still do not support self-determination, saying that, oh, Kashmir is an integral part of India. Now, Kashmir therefore becomes a very easy tool to use by Hindu nationalists in India to discipline everyone. It's like the Ram Janmabhoomi movement they had over the mosque. They destroyed a mosque, then they said it's a birthplace of a particular god, and those kind of things, right? So Kashmir is the most convenient issue that Indian nationalists find in order to discipline everyone, including Indian progressives. So the Indian progressive, Indian left would have the struggle that if they support Kashmiri movement of self-determination, they get accused of being anti-national. If they get accused of being anti-national, then they become electorally weak. And they're already electorally weak. So that's the problem that they face. But you do have Maoists in India who talk about self-determination for Kashmir, for instance. But they're on the fringe. Now, in terms of occupation, administration, of course, Pakistani side, Indian side, control, and all of this, the reality is it is an occupation. It's an occupation both by India and both by Pakistan. Right. And this is where they become somewhat similar. Because they both occupy, they use different languages, of course, to occupy. One would use Azad Jammu and Kashmir as if it is Azad. When you look at the constitution of AJK, you find it very clear that those, and I'm sure our friend here also, you have to take an oath to say that you have to work towards accession to Pakistan. That itself shows it's not Azad, because Azadi would imply both India and Pakistan under UN resolutions, but also freedom, which is independence option, because you can't have self-determination which is already predetermined by the two existing nation states, which, as you pointed out, act like those nationalist nations who don't want to compromise and who want to fight over territory. So what we find with Indian and Pakistani nationalisms over Kashmir is certain proprietorial zone. We own it. So India saying Kashmir is an integral part of India, essentially means that Kashmiris have no rights. They can't decide. We own it. But that's the language of ownership. And I would argue that that's language of ownership is language of colonialism. This is why for those of you who were there in the previous session, so I'll repeat for you and for others also, that India and Pakistan are not properly post-colonial states or moved away from imperialism. They are colonial states in various ways where they're trying to create a state within the territory that they control. And India in this context is of course more brutally colonial than Pakistan because the opposition there has been stronger than Pakistan. In terms of gender, there are so many questions, but in terms of gender aspects, it links to that, the way in which that possessiveness takes place. But I'll say more about the Indian national part here, or Pakistani national, jugular vein, integral part. I mean, you could say to them, just get life. It's a territory, let them decide. Now, Pakistan is cleverer in that. They do say that, we respect right to self-determination. And my position would be, if you respect right to self-determination, then you cannot have even an interim constitution that says very clearly that you have to be a Muslim to be president, prime minister, which is odd, because Jammu and Kashmir is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And second, say it works towards access in Pakistan. And of course, Indians, they don't even pretend to be, to provide any kind of freedom. They say we provide autonomy, but even that is being eroded away. And Indian nationalists, what they have done is essentially made Kashmir into a nationalist ego issue where they can't compromise. So what we find therefore is denial of self-determination to people of Jammu and Kashmir by both India and Pakistan, and we find is grave violation of human rights in Indian occupied side. But the term I would use for both would be occupied. The Azadi question, maybe I'll do it next.
The regional geopolitics, maybe would you like to say something now?
Yeah, okay. The regional geopolitics, I would say, is, of course, you have to think of why would Kashmir is an interesting and important issue, not only for people of Jammu and Kashmir, but it's important for India and Pakistan because it fits in with their regional geopolitics completely, but also the different versions of nationalism. But when we take example of the struggle that India and Pakistan have vis-a-vis Central Asia, vis-a-vis Afghanistan, tension with China, the CPEC kind of issue, Kashmir becomes very important to it. So we can expand that maybe during the question now.
Okay. So, thank you, Devesh. The increasing communalism around this question of Kashmir makes some of this talk of actually speaking about Kashmir with any sincerity very difficult. I've said this in the past that almost every narrative on Kashmir is landmined with vested interests. It's very hard to kind of find narratives on Kashmir that are not self-serving. In that sense, and the focus on territory as opposed to people. The question really is then, if an ever greater number of us are recognizing the fact that it cannot be denied that there is an occupation of Kashmir by these post-colonial states that are not that have not moved beyond the coloniality, so they are post without the hyphen colonial, they still continue to be marked by that coloniality in the way they function themselves, then I want to take that question to you, Sasha, and begin by asking you, why is it so hard for people to recognize occupation? How has the language shifted, to now increasingly some kind of recognition? Why is there a cloud of silence around Kashmir in the international community? So maybe if you could say a bit about that, as well as about when we talk of silences, then the role of media becomes really important. So address that maybe as well.
Absolutely. I think it's really, thank you for inviting us here today. I think it's really important that we are here today because for the past 10 years almost we've been trying with the university and with the colleges to have this conversation about Kashmir. And our block has been our use of language, and the use of language to say Indian occupied Kashmir and Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which they have objected to having that discourse and that use of language, preferring to use the Indian administered and Pakistan administered. So right from the outset there's a battle of silence and a battle of even space to have a voice for people. So I think the credit to the Literature Festival for having this conversation here today. And so that silence continues not just within England, but within, if you look at the role of media within India, so the complete blackout of news outlets, of social media, of any form of communication within the valley, and I speak from a person from within the valley, so within that valley, that silence that it creates, when you're living in Kashmir, the bubble of unknown and not knowing what's happening around you because you're kept away from that. And so the dialogue and the conversation that happens around you is very much of creating enemies, so creating the others. Pakistan is doing this to us, or India is doing this to us. And so it creates a real language of hatred within people there and hatred of the unknown. So people don't know who they're there to hate and who's there to protect them, so they almost then accept the occupation there as a protection, but it's anything far from that. So you see young people now having grown up for the past 23 years almost with an occupation of military in the valley. You know, a valley which has 6.5 million population and over 1 million military personnel there, so that's almost 1 to every 6 people is a military, and living there you cannot move for yards without seeing bunkers, which really interesting. In the past 3 or 4 years the bunkers have started to disappear, but we were having this conversation about how those bunkers then continue to exist within your mind, and how the way that the media plays on people's minds and creates that fear, continues to create that fear within people, and takes away any form of personalisation, any form of humanisation from the person. And the language that's used by the media, by media in England as well, about Kashmir, about this ownership of the land. You know, Pakistan will say Kashmir Hamara hai, so Kashmir belongs to us. And you know, there was a match 2 weeks ago, and there were people with T-shirts, you know, there saying the winner takes Kashmir, and that's the kind of language that, you know, is acceptable, that people will see. And what's interesting though is, even with this complete blanket ban on media, how the young are using social media to raise their voices, to share their stories, and find ways around that to get voices out. So you always see that people in England and around the world have a much more understanding of what's happening in Kashmir than people in Kashmir do themselves. And that, but at the same time, there's still the silence from the international community, from the governments around the world, to acknowledge the human rights abuses that happen in Kashmir. And we almost say them, you know, like throwaway comments, the pellet injuries that happen there, and not thinking about the people behind those pellet injuries and how, you know, you'll hear people talk about pellet bullets being a non-violent form of crowd control. And again, that's the language that you hear people saying. So then, somebody who might not understand how a pellet injury affects somebody will think, oh, they're using non-violent forms of crowd control. But then you look at the difference between people in Kashmir and people in India in terms of power control, and we saw that when the protests came out about rapes in India, and power control was used with water, and the difference in how citizens of Kashmir are treated to citizens in India really showed that this whole conversation about Kashmir being an integral part of India and Kashmir being part of that country is not true in reality. And then in terms of the gender, when you look at the effect of the occupation on women and children, Kashmir has the largest number of orphanages. It's almost a business that's been created there to have orphanages in the place. Women have been affected in terms of the rapes, which we still see no justice for. Those mass rapes that have taken place, for the disappearances of people from their families, and how that affects people. And we don't talk about those things about how it's affecting people, because we're talking about the big geopolitical situation in Kashmir, which completely dehumanises what's happening to people on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. This very important point that people who are being claimed in the name of democracy or in the name of liberation actually do not experience any of that. You have to, and the way the land has been, the way the lines have been drawn in history by imperial, post-imperial powers is that you actually have to come to the other side of the world to meet people who maybe live just less than 100 miles from you. It's, certainly for many Kashmiris within India, the first time that they meet people who are Kashmiris from the other side is actually in places like London. You have to be on the other side of the world to meet your neighbor. The very important question of the bans, the media blackouts, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act type of emergency legislation that has been in place now for over 2.5 decades, and the patronage of different kinds of interests that serve the centers in India and Pakistan rather than the Kashmiri people themselves. I would, with that, I want to, and previously I conceptualized this in terms of what I've called a Mandarin-Machiavelli interaction. The powers, the Mandarins in Delhi and Islamabad, and the Machiavellian patrons that they've had. It's an old colonial sort of strategy. So the interests of the people at the periphery are not to actually care about, often, not always, but often not to care about the people to whom they are beholden, but actually to deliver some kind of control of that region to the centers of power in Delhi and Islamabad. And I think that's this question of how do we move beyond some of this is what I would like to address to you, Sardar Masood Khan, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here, and I'm generally speaking satisfied by the tone and tenor of the discussion so far. In your introduction, you have tried to be equidistant, and the panelists have expressed their views independently. My tone is going to be a bit strident, and there's a reason for that. I think that I do not necessarily agree with the parameters or the premise of this debate. I think the topic here is way forward. Is it not? Yes. So let's not overemphasize the complexity of the issue. It is not a religious issue. It is not a communal issue. It is a political issue, primarily. And its solution has been prescribed. It was prescribed by the United Nations in the 1950s. They prescribed a UN-led, UN-supervised plebiscite. The prescription was asked the people of Kashmir what they want. Self-determination. They were the ones to decide whether they want to join India or Pakistan. Well, let me tell you, there are two glaring realities in Kashmir right now. Let's not go into history. One is the massive killings and human rights violations bordering on what you would call crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, because the entire territory of what we call the occupied Kashmir has been cordoned off by Indian security forces, and they kill with impunity. And they do it in the name of law and order. They do it in the name of patriotism, or whatever you call it. And the other reality is the people of Kashmir, particularly the valley, they're demanding Azadi. Azadi means freedom. And in fact, they are rejecting Indian grit. They have done so. Now, in the past 7 decades, India has tried naked coercion. It has tried economic blandishments. It has recruited its allies in the valley and the occupied districts. And it has demonized Kashmiris as irresponsible, as militants, as extremists, backed by Pakistan. And here the irony is the victimizer becomes the victim. The oppressed projects itself. The oppressor projects itself as the oppressed. It's a political issue. It's about the right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And they have vowed that under all circumstances they will continue their struggle. And they would win their freedom, as the people of India want their freedom, and as the people of Pakistan want their freedom. When we were talking, most of you were talking about India and Pakistan, and you were reflexively, unconsciously eliminating the key constituent in the situation, is the people of Kashmir. They're the ones who have to decide their future. Let me tell you that the total area of this territory called Jammu and Kashmir is 85,000 square miles, and the total population is 20 million, nearly 20 million. Now, they are the ones who have to decide their future in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. And you said that Azad Kashmir is also under occupation. It is not. 2 reasons. One, the people of Azad Kashmir, and I come from Azad Kashmir, we liberated every inch of the territory. We waged a war not against India at that time, but against the Maharaja, and we liberated this territory from the tyrannical rule of the Maharaja. All these tribes living here in this part of Kashmir, they opposed and resisted the tyranny of Maharaja for decades, even before 1947. So this is a reality. We were talking about history before 1947. The other reason is that what differentiates Azad Kashmir from the administration, or the so-called autonomous administration in the Indian occupied Kashmir, is that in Azad Kashmir, we have trappings of a state, but we do not have a state. It's a quasi-state. We have the president and prime minister, and we have a bicameral legislature, an upper chamber and a lower chamber, and we also have a Supreme Court and a High Court. And why do we have all these trappings? Because we have given this commitment to the United Nations Security Council, to India and the people of Kashmir, that this setup would remain interim and would remain temporary until the people of Kashmir have made their decision, until the disposition of the state of Jammu and Kashmir has been determined. Way forward, I think that what we should do is that we should pursue diplomacy. This vicious cycle of violence must come to an end, and all parties should prefer the negotiating table to the come. And whether these are bilateral talks, and I think Kashmiris want negotiations through bilateral talks, through the United Nations, some mediation, some conciliation effort, good offices, third party, whatever. But we must use political idiom and political vehicles to find a solution. This is my clear-cut message, and do not try to exclude the Kashmiris, the population of Kashmir, from a lasting and a just solution of the Kashmir dispute. You have raised many issues, and I don't know whether I'm interested in now or later.
Yes, we can come back to that.
We can come back to that.
That's fine. So, thank you. I think we have all laid our cards on the table. So you have an idea of the different positions and the similarities and differences between what we are saying. So, for example, I think that it is hard to disagree that Kashmir is not, neither historically nor in a sense is it even, it's being communalized, but it's not fundamentally not a communal issue. On that I would certainly agree with you that it's, it's a political issue. It's an issue where people have been, made scapegoats of power brokering by important actors. It's not, but communalizing it serves a purpose for many of the parties who have vested interests in that notion. The question of history, I think one way or the other keeps coming back because, although if, it's that thing of if I wanted to go to B, I wouldn't start from here, but unfortunately we have inherited the histories that we have, and at that point, when there was the talk of plebiscite, this idea that many Kashmiris now have in I won't say J&K because it's in Kashmir, I would say, is of an azadi that ideally would be not about India and not about Pakistan. So they find that there is no space for that youth to, there are obvious reasons why one would think that if they have been dehumanized by Indian security forces and by Indian media for a long time, there's an obvious reason why they would look to Pakistan. However, scratching beneath the surface, it's not hard to find a desire as well, which is not about India, not about Pakistan, but about actually claiming an identity that is Kashmiri, which then poses the next problem of, which is where the imbroglio has started out from, of who is Kashmiri. Because, you would have heard, I hesitate to use the term Valley supremacism, but there is this idea of who's the real Kashmiri, and if people who are in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or what you would call Azad Kashmir, are actually Kashmiri, even by those who are seeking Azadi. So that gets us to this whole other question of dimension of, who counts as a Kashmiri and when is that a legitimate thing. But I agree with you that the violence must definitely stop. And that if we look at many of the other, we can look at Northern Ireland, even though, sometimes things unravel, it is possible at points to bring people together, to have enough representation and enough dialogue and diplomacy that we can move forward. So we should never give up that hope. I don't know if, because there was clearly a disagreement, so maybe Dibesh or Sasha, do you want to say something again? And as long as you're not at each other's throats, we don't want any violence. You can disagree with each other, and that's part of how conversations move forward. But
reflecting on Sasha, you're right. In a sense, we start sitting here and then talking to people, and of course there are different kinds of people. The basic thing to keep in mind is it is a political issue, no doubt, and it's an international dispute. It's a political issue, but in the end, it's also the human issue. And that we have to keep in mind. So what you pointed out about dehumanization is very crucial, because we do find specifically in Indian occupied Kashmir extreme form of dehumanization that has taken shape of not only, of course, killing, murder, extrajudicial murder, which is war crime, but also torture. It has taken place in terms of mass blinding, as you pointed out, but also enforced disappearance, use of mass rape. The Indian state has been experimenting with all brutal forms of violence over Kashmiri population, and it gets away with it. In 1990s, when the armed insurgency were at its peak, most people in India, and I remember growing up, we didn't know anything about Kashmir. So for us, there was no demonization of Kashmiris. The state was doing something there. Yeah, it was Pakistan-backed and something is happening. But what's new in India now, and which is more dangerous, is there's a popularization of demonization of Kashmiri amongst Indians. There's a hatred of Kashmir, which makes the diplomacy even more difficult. Because the Indian nationalists, and especially the Hindu nationalists, are using Kashmir issue to make it into something on which no one can compromise. That's how they put it. Now, in terms of, so we agree, for me, the problem would be, and this is where I think I'll agree with you on this, imagine if you're talking about Azadi means freedom. Freedom in this context means right of people of Jammu and Kashmir to determine their fate for themselves. Right? That's a very basic thing. Now going back, and you're right, AJK constitution, unlike J&K constitution, makes it very clear it's interim. It's interim part. Now for me, it's a very odd situation. It's an odd situation is because, in a sense, Pakistan has, and even Pakistan, let's say AJK government has this option of being a better model, right? Better hope for, let's say, people under occupation, under Indian occupation. Why? So if you look at the constitution, interim constitution of J&K, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, it says very clearly the leader has to be Muslim. Now, Jammu and Kashmir, as I said, is a multi-religious state. So how can you say that it is a liberated area, it's a quasi-state, which is temporary, and then say it's not a religious issue if I'm not saying people like you, like if people who are elected have to be Muslim, where does it leave non-Muslims? The Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Muslims, whatever, it doesn't. So for me, therefore, that is a big problem with the AJK constitution, that it makes it a religious issue. By making it clear that elected people have to be Muslims, and of course, not Ahmadis, Muslims. And second part, of course, would be related to that, work toward accession to Pakistan. So how can it be a freedom, a model, where you don't allow the right for Azadi? Okay, you can't allow pro-India, I understand that, but not even Azadi. So what happens then is, you have got political parties and leaders who are members of Pakistani political parties, PMLN, PTI, PPP, most of them. Now, if you take example of Indian occupied Kashmir, the two political parties, including Jammu and Kashmir National Conference, which uses the term national. Now, it's very curious, it's a national conference. National, it's not Indian national, it's like Jammu and Kashmir National. You still have those parties more or less finished off, but still in power. So what I'm trying to say that it is a political solution. An ideal solution would be one where you have dialogue amongst people of Jammu and Kashmir first and foremost. India and Pakistan back off. Yes, big one. And second would be that India and Pakistan get involved, but they get involved as saying that, look, we support you in whatever you want. And we support you not because of religious reasons, religious ties, but we support you because you're people in the end who should not be dehumanized. And in that place, I do think that AJK is in a better position to be a better model than Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian occupied parties. And for that, it has to start by allowing space for Azadi rather than only for pro-Pakistan.
That's actually a very important point that I think that in the Q&A as well that we'll come back to is how do we conceptualize Azadi and if we actually take the term to mean Azadi, because as we can often see in international media, in much of the discourse, this whole India and Pakistan thing, the shadow boxing, the constant posturing between India and Pakistan makes default places Kashmir in that position where it's a prize that these two countries are fighting over. And in the West, again, I think it plays into that larger narrative of immature post-colonial nations who cannot handle their affairs and they're like dogs fighting over a bone and it'll never get solved. It then leads to a pessimism, and then people think, well, it'll never get solved, so what's the point? They'll just keep fighting about it. It'll just be one of those perennial disputes. So if India, and the question is of whether there is such enlightened leadership in these countries and the goodwill to actually let Kashmiris be able to develop their own voices, their own kind of leadership which is not encumbered and overwhelmed by the shadow of India and Pakistan, to be able to move forward and to some kind of reconciliation of the different narratives. I mean, Aga Shah really talked about it as a way of history getting in the way of memory. It's true, different Kashmiris remember different histories, and sometimes it needs the acknowledgement of different narratives, of people who have seen and experienced different things. Sasha, do you want to say something else? And then maybe if you speak, and then
I think there's something very much about moving forward is about democracy, about self-determination, but as much as we say that that's the way forward and people on the ground will say that they want the right to self-determination, we have to acknowledge that there are vested interests by both India and Pakistan not to solve this issue, and that it is, and that actually there's a huge amount of whether it's economic, social, geographical interest in that region to not solve the issue, and that's where then actually the international community has a much bigger role to play, because India and Pakistan will not solve this issue amongst themselves, and they will not allow the people of Kashmir and that's the entire region of Kashmir to have that self-determination, which is why we're 60 years on, 70 years on, and still in the same place, because there's no interest for them to make that position. And I say that, having seen the different histories, that there isn't a way forward by just saying we will move towards negotiations and move towards democracy, because that is not playing out in reality. And I think there's something about both sides have to acknowledge that they do need to demilitarize in the area. They do need to back away from that, and only then allow any form of disposal discussion to happen from the ground. because at the moment the discussion is of everybody but Kashmiris.
You're absolutely, this is a really important point. This, the way in which this, the idea of, you must have heard of this, that India, and for a moment I'm speaking about India, India says that to the world, it says Kashmir is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, so we don't want the world to speak about it. And then to Pakistan, it says, although I suppose you could change the actors and it might hold true, to Pakistan it says that it's an internal issue and that it's not bilateral. And to Kashmiris it says it's not an issue at all. There's nothing to talk about here. Everything will be fine, and we just have to give the developmental and it will be okay. This question of the vested interests, of the economic interests especially, that conflict is profitable. Not just to India and Pakistan, but to many other countries in the world that export weapons, with whom alliances are forged. Upton Sinclair said once, it's very hard to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on his not understanding it. So this idea that, as long as the conflict goes on, there are lots of reasons why, and why it will continue. The question is, how do we how do we have better models? How do we sort of infiltrate the structures of power, the structures of decision making, in order to imagine better futures?
Well, I think that the context should be humanity in Kashmir. Basically, the people of Jammu and Kashmir are suffering, and they've been suffering for the past 7 decades, and this suffering must come to an end. They deserve better. I mean, you're from Kashmir yourself, and you from Kashmir.
See, now nobody in my part of the world would not know that immediately from my surname. Yes.
Well, you lost me.
Yes.
I would say,
another history.
I mean, no matter what perceptions you have about Kashmiris, they are peace-loving people. They love music, handicraft, arts, commerce, trade. These were their characteristics. So I think they should not be projected as monsters, as militants. They are not. In fact, they do not want to. The people of Jammu and Kashmir do not want to become a nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan. They want to become a symbol of peace and amity and harmony. And this reality must be registered. These are peaceful, peace-loving people. They should be given some breathing space, for God's sake. Second thing is that, in terms of way forward, I think that killings, as I said earlier, must come to an end. And we should move the parties to the dispute to the peace table. From the war zones to the peace table. This is what we need. And we should not reject any facilitation, any mediation, whether it is from the United Nations, whether it is from a third party, whether it is behind the scenes facilitation of some sort of dialogue and diplomacy. For God's sake, welcome that, and do not make an issue in terms of your chauvinism. And you talked about this rise of Hindu extremism. People have been talking about Islamic fundamentalism. We see that there could be this clash of fundamentalisms. And the simplest way to avert and avoid that is to promote dialogue on Kashmir. And we should work on intra-Kashmir dialogue, intra-Kashmir trade, intra-Kashmir confidence building measures. There are rudiments of that kind of communication and connectivity, but these need to be developed further. Let me tell you, you raised some very important points, and briefly I'll comment on some of them. You said, why is there a cloud of silence in the international community? And my answer to that is, it's because of economic ties of India with powerful nations, and they see profit in India, and I call this mercantile diplomacy. And they will look the other way when it comes to human rights violations in India. This second reality is that India has somehow convinced Washington, the United Kingdom, London and Brussels that they would decelerate the rise of China and that they would deliver China on a platter to these powerful nations, and that this is a lofty goal somehow. And that's why I think that because of these strategic considerations, they do not speak up. I've been talking to officials in Brussels, in London, and Washington, and I've been raising this issue of double standards in regard to Kashmir. The duplicity of double standards. Who is a Kashmiri? May I ask a question? Who is an Indian? Is it just the passport that defines an Indian? Or who is a Pakistani? Or who is a US citizen? I mean, of course, there's multiplicity. I mean, you can't have monolithic states, and that's why you have federations. And therefore, Kashmiris, when you try to define Kashmiris, those people living in the state of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, are Kashmiris. And let them decide about their future. You raise the issue of gender, and the biggest reality has been that in the past 3 to 4 decades, rape and sexual molestation has been used as an instrument of war in the Indian occupied Kashmir. Women have been the worst victim of this conflict. And this reality must be reversed. And it has nothing to do with religion. I think that all enlightened people have spoken up and condemned these practices by the occupation forces. Independence. Is there a third option? Right now, in the United Nations Security Council, there are 2 options. One is accede to India or Pakistan, and this dates back to the 1947 Independence Act. But let me tell you that until a new option is introduced, either in the United Nations Security Council or through consultations between India, Pakistan, and Kashmiris, these 2 options are on the table. And I can elaborate on that, but probably I'll do that during Q&A. But let me also tell you that it's my hope that Indian civil society would not continue to be a party to the crimes being committed by the occupation forces. Because India is a big country. India believes in enlightenment. India espouses secularism. And they won independence from the United Kingdom. They waged a freedom struggle. Why would they deny it to the Kashmiris, for God's sake? I fail to understand that. And let me tell you that when we talk about accession to Pakistan, these are aspirations of the people of Azad Kashmir or Gilgit-Baltistan. But has the government of Pakistan ever said that they would block their choice to accede to India? They have not. They have made several statements in the United Nations that Kashmiris should be given a choice to freely exercise their right to self-determination. Somebody said that India, and there was applause from the audience, that India and Pakistan should back off. But Pakistan would not back off, because Pakistan is the only advocate of the international community of the Kashmiris. If they back off, they would be left helpless and rudderless. And India would say, now India would never abandon them. And now since Pakistan has abandoned Kashmiris, now it is a case not of self-determination but of secession. And they would deal directly with the Kashmiris. And therefore Pakistan would never cease to support the cause of Kashmiris, let me tell you. I've talked about geopolitics, and with due deference I would say that in all conflicts, whether this is a conflict in Mali or South Sudan or Western Sahara, there are vested interests. But the bigger reality is that you should look for a solution, a win-win solution for the people. You have to transcend those vested interests and those toxic fault lines which divide people and which deny them their basic rights.
Thank you. That's, I think, yes, I did understand that we finished. So you're right that every conflict has the vested interests, and so the question really is how do we create the incentives to align those interests in such a way that we move towards a better solution or towards some resolution rather than the situation now. And in the past, many people say there have been missed opportunities, including in the last few decades, where some kind of move could have been made to move towards a better idea of Kashmir. The point about, I think the point, and I hope that in the Q&A we'll come to that Pakistan's support for the cause. It's really interesting how that the enlightened civil society in India that is at this moment struggling against a whole host of other kinds of transformations and oppressions in India, when they do recognize Kashmir, actually the Pakistan's advocacy of Kashmir ends up becoming something that makes it more difficult to argue that case very often, which is again within a nationalist parameter not hard to understand. Plus the international system of states tends to often be conservative and not look favorably towards the creation of new states, which is why so many failed states continue. On the question of economic ties, the India and Pakistan have in the past been able to deal with each other economically and put Kashmir to one side. So we don't know if we can, I would say, really rely on what we have to do so hard is to create that consciousness in these two countries to make that happen. But maybe it's the people that will force their hands. In the 1990s, the Kashmiris who were growing up used to have this, you speak to any kind of 20, 30-year-old Kashmiris in their 20s and 30s, they would say that the way their hearts would palpitate when they would see security forces, because they would have to think, well, do I have my ID card? What would happen right now? And they themselves look at the youth of today and they are surprised. They're saying these people are picking up the stones and throwing them right in the face of security forces. So it's that brutality has also generated its own kind of immunity in the way that Kashmiri people are responding, which again leads to often a greater escalation of violence. The double standards, absolutely. Huntington called this the king country syndrome. There's, not somebody I'm sure we admire, but this idea that if you are serving our interests or if you are akin to us, we don't care about your duplicity. And we see some of that clearly in the Trump-Modi, in the India-US sort of posturing around diplomacy, around democracy right now. The vastly different notions of different Kashmiris about what the future should be, and that's where the dialogue comes in, right? The different kinds of Kashmiris, what they have, what they remember, and how they want to move on. You can talk about people in Dogras, the Gujars, the Kashmiri Muslims, Kashmiri Pandits, people from Mirpur, people from Muzaffarabad. All of the people in these different regions have their own kind of narratives, which, that is the real challenge. How do we create the space where we blend these narratives in some way to move forward? And it's a challenge, but it's really important too, because otherwise the suffering just continues. Shall we open the floor up to questions? Okay. I'm told that we don't have that much of a shortage of time, so we can be okay. Let's just, is there a roving mic, or how do these festival people, how do they just have to speak really loud, is it? Okay. There is a mic, there was a mic here. Okay. Right, so please speak up. I'll start from one side of the room, the person there.
Hi, I just want to start off by saying that the conversation that we're having, we need to start from the premise that this is a post-colonial issue. We have to address the fact that it was Britain that occupied India, and this is as a result of that. So first of all, people who praise the British Empire want to actually take some responsibility in looking at the subject. It's not just a South Asian subject, it's something that must be addressed by all of us. The second thing I want to address is that there's definitely oppression going on in Jammu Kashmir. There's rape being used as a tool of war, and all sorts of other issues, and it needs to be highlighted. But what we're doing is we must start by decolonising our own minds first, and then addressing the issue from a non-biased perspective, not from the perspective of an Indian and not a Pakistani, because those notions didn't exist prior to colonialism. So we must look at it from a very unbiased point of view. The issue at hand is that we're conflating two things. We're conflating people of the value of Kashmir. So we're looking at this from a value of Kashmir-centric point of view. We're not addressing the issue from a humanistic point of view. There are other populations in Kashmir itself who are being oppressed. There are Pahari populations in the other side of the border who are being oppressed. Even the Dogra community, to an extent, are oppressed the Pahari community. They're one of the most disenfranchised communities in Jammu Kashmir. Equally, the population of Azad Kashmir, I put in quotes because technically I wouldn't agree that it is Azad, but Azad Kashmiris are also being oppressed, but they're blindly being oppressed because they seem to think that Pakistan is on their side. So as this gentleman, this official clearly stated, that Pakistan is apparently on the side of Kashmir, I'd say that that is perhaps debatable. We don't have our own airport in Azad Kashmir. We don't have full access to electricity. A lot of the electricity goes to Pakistan. We are also an oppressed people on the other side, but we cease to see that. So I think there are things that need to be addressed. Even in the UK, I'll keep it short, but even in the UK, in the description that we gave about this talk today, we said 70% of the population are Pakistani Kashmiris. We are not, first of all, Pakistani people, and 70% of us are actually Paharis. Paharis as a people, many people don't regard them as Kashmiris. So other Kashmiris would say we are not Kashmiri. We have a different, perhaps a different ethnicity, a different language. So this is something that needs to be addressed as a disenfranchised community, as a group of people who are constantly being oppressed by Pakistan, by Kashmir and by India. We must address this as a notion that there are various other groups, and particularly the Bahari population, we must address their issues and their identity.
Thank you. Can we take, sorry?
Hari is not the Kamis.
We'll take 3 or 4 questions together. That woman over there, yes, in the back. I'll just take one from each section and then another.
Hi. When I say Kashmir, I would be talking about the Kashmir in Jammu and India. So my question is regarding the leadership. So India is a democratic country, and there are elections every 5 years, national elections, and there are state elections too. But somehow Kashmiris, they do not accept this democratic government or the democracy that India offers them, and they have not been accepting it since it started. I mean, it has been there for a long time. Is it possible that if Kashmiris start participating in it, they might actually get a leader who will stand for them? A leader who is, say, not from the other parties, and say who is not in the house arrest all the time. So should Kashmiris start participating in this democratic process?
Thank you. The person there at the back, yes, you in the blue coat.
Thank you. It's Javed Akhtar from Leeds. My question to the panel is that what role can we as a British citizens of this country can play to make sure that what we have witnessed just recently in this country with the Brexit and the opportunity was given to the British people to decide either to remain with the Europe or leave. And if we just go back in 12 months ago, the people in Scotland were given the opportunity. The lady just spoke about the democracy in India, but absolutely there is a democracy in India, but let the Indians be given the opportunity to Kashmiris, let them decide for their own future. And what role should we be playing as a British citizens of this country and highlight the importance of the issue of Kashmir?
Right, thank you. And you, if you were
right. Professor Anand said something about the constitution of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir. The president or prime minister cannot be a non-Muslim. But I've travelled many miles this morning to be here to talk about an issue which is, I think it's a success story, but it's only a partial success story. And I'm grateful that a scholar and an international diplomat like Sardar Masood Khan Sahab has been elected as the president of Azad Kashmir. But when we talk about Indian Kashmir, we are in a traumatized state. Growing as a child, I heard what happened in 1919 in Kannan Pashpura, or we hear about the brutalization and rape of women or the half-widows. But my concern at the moment is what Professor Anand said, that can a non-Muslim become the Prime Minister or the President of Azad Kashmir? When I come here as a representative of the hopes and aspirations of thousands of Kashmiris, Azad Kashmiris, who call themselves Christian Kashmiris, and they're not migrants from anywhere. I mean, I've got the reports on socio-economic situations of Kashmiris, and most of them are the state subject, the Bashinda Riyasat Darja Awwal. And it's unfortunate that I had to travel so many miles away from Kashmir in order to have a political representation or access to our president. So I can represent that there are Christian Kashmiris living in Kashmir, but the website of the Azad Riyasat of Jammu and Kashmir says that Azad Jammu and Kashmir is a 100% Muslim area, which is factually incorrect. I mean, if you can kindly change that after the census, there's a census happened in Kashmir, and we can change that there are, if not hundreds of thousands of Kashmiris who are Christian Kashmiris but there are thousands of Kashmiris who are Christian Kashmiris. When we talk about Hindu and Muslim Kashmiris and Sikh Kashmiris, we should also talk about Christian Kashmiris, and that would give us the articulation of, I think people like myself can articulate the case of Kashmir as a non-communal issue when we talk about people who are Kashmiri Sikhs or Kashmiri Christians. And not just Kashmiri Hindus or Kashmiri Muslims.
Sure, thank you. It's I have no idea who's who in the audience except for this, for Chala who's taking the camera. So it's brilliant to have such a diverse range of questions that come from non-obvious places, and that in itself indicates to us the complexity of what's at hand. I have so much to say, but here's the panel. So would you like to respond to the first set, and then I'll take one question from each section again. Who wants to speak?
I'll respond to the question on leadership.
Yes,
elections. I think, yes, there is a democracy in India which seems to allow a certain amount of democracy in Kashmir itself, but that democracy is quite selective. So if you look at the media bans, if you look at the treatment of people, it's a very selective democracy that takes place in Kashmir. And where elections have happened, and they have elected people from within Kashmir, so if you look at the case of Mehbooba Mufti being elected, and kind of how actually brutality in the past 2 years has increased from having a local person representing Kashmir, the brutality has increased there. So I think that leadership question of who our next leadership generation is a huge dilemma and a huge challenge for the region, but also something that we need to allow to develop and develop from the grassroots without the suppression of the states around it.
Yes.
Okay.
Is it very short, the intervention, because I want the panel to respond to
My
what...
question was like, should people go out to vote?
Yes, we will address that.
So in fact,
yes.
okay, so thanks to all of you, and we take it as more as comment for us to learn, because the whole idea is not for us to tell you what's right, what's wrong, but to listen to other people. We also, starting with the elections, yes, you have to remember that Kashmir did participate in the Indian supervisory elections at various points in time, right? They have participated, sometimes they have not participated. Sometimes they've been forced to participate, sometimes they've been sold that, and this is the interesting part. So the political parties in Jammu and Kashmir, they, including Congress by the way, right? When they go and campaign in the valley, they don't say that there's no political dispute. They say there's a political problem that will be resolved later in dialogue between India, Pakistan and us, but for the time being, for the issues of development and governance, you should participate in both, right? And people have done that. And yet, what they get is Mehbooba Mufti kind of government, right? What they've gotten since 1950s is National Congress, which in the beginning hardly would get elected because they would just nominate people. So the problem in case of democracy in Kashmir is that India has used democracy usually used by people to gain power vis-a-vis the state. Democracy has been used by India, the Indian state, to deny opportunity and deny true democracy to people in the name of democracy. So that's what it has to create. So in a sense, that's the challenge. So I don't think participating in election is going to resolve the issue until unless Indian democracy becomes confident enough to allow people right to self-determination within democracy. And that should be there, within democracy. Now, and which goes back to my also disquiet with the AJK constitution, right? So I'm not equating the two in terms of the violence they do, but I'm equating the two in terms of the denial of voices that are different from the dominant community in this context, right? So for instance, it also goes back to I see it as a colonial project. So in my own book, I see Indian and Pakistani states as colonial projects rather than post-colonial in any form. But they're more colonial than British in some senses, right? Now, what Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, including all parts, right, can offer is actually Azadi to Pakistanis and Indians. They can offer a model of working with each other because it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, plural society and plural entity. They can offer ways of dialoguing with each other and kind of Azadi, which can inspire others, Indians and Pakistanis, to follow. Because when you look at India and Pakistan, I'm sorry, the kind of lynchings that go in both countries, some in name of blasphemy, some in name of cow or whatever, that's not freedom. In fact, Kashmir should inspire Indians and Pakistan and teach them some lesson there. And that's what I was saying. Thank you.
In particular, maybe that question you would like to say.
Well, a couple of points. First, Jammu and Kashmir is a diverse region. You have Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists.
And Christians.
And Christians. Yes, absolutely. They are there. And we respect that. Let me tell you that leave this decision to the Kashmiris. They will decide when Kashmiris will be given a choice about governance, about their political structure. Leave it to the Kashmiris. They have the wisdom and the wherewithal to come up with a solution. All constitutions have certain limitations which are not rational. There are limitations in the US Constitution, in the unwritten Constitution of the United Kingdom, and constitutions all around the world. But leave it to the popular will to sort them out. Let me also tell you that there was a gentleman who was not very deferential to Azad Kashmir, called me an official, although I'm the elected president of Azad Kashmir. Give some respect to democracy. Pay lip service. But let me tell you.
Can I just say that I wasn't aware that you were the president, so I do apologise for that. But I just mean any disrespect.
And you said, you were a bit sarcastic, you said it's not Azad. It is Azad. And if you haven't visited Azad Kashmir, I extend this invitation to you. We are guests in Muzaffarabad, and I'll take you to all the four corners of Azad Kashmir and see for yourself that the people of Azad Kashmir are free. And let me also tell you that we do not see ourselves as colonial subjects. We are citizens, for God's sake. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, we waged a struggle against the tyrannical rule of the Maharaja of Kashmir and we liberated our territory. And we are proud of that. We liberated every inch of that territory. And our movement for liberation was halted and obstructed on the 26th of October 1947. But that's another story. Let me tell you, let me assure you, all of you, that Azad Kashmir is Azad, come there. But some very important questions have been raised here. One is, what should the diaspora communities or the British here can do to promote the cause of Kashmir, or to promote a solution of the Kashmir dispute? I've been talking to the MPs here, newly elected MPs, and I've said the following things and I want to reiterate. One, please, for God's sake, raise the profile of Kashmir in the House of Commons. Second, try to activate the United Nations and its role and promote application and observance of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law, because Kashmir is not an island. What happens is that people look at the Kashmir issue through the prism of India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed states. And in the process, Kashmir disappears from the radar screen. That it is a commodity which can be transacted for God's sake, if human rights violations are egregious there, don't do anything, because these are two nuclear armed states, and artificially balance your policies towards them or tilt towards India, or look the other way when it comes to the human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir. But for God's sake, this territory with the population of 20 million exists on this planet. This is what I want to emphasize. The British can also forge bipartisan consensus. We have quite a bit of traction within the Labour Party, but we need outreach to the Conservative Party also, and a bipartisan consensus to nudge the parties to the dispute to move towards the peace deal. This is what we need from the British Parliament. You asked a question about the elections. We've been calling these elections farcical, and that they are not representative of people of Jammu and Kashmir. What has happened dates back to the 1950s, because India came up with a controversy that said that, look, yes, there is a yes, it was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister, who took the issue to the Security Council, and the Security Council prescribed a dispensation, and they were uncomfortable with that, and they said, we will have a Constituent Assembly, and that Constituent Assembly was rigged. 75 seats were rigged, the entire composition of the Constituent Assembly. And there what they decided was that the kind of election that they would have, this is a substitute for the plebiscite which was prescribed by the United Nations. And since then, Kashmiris have not trusted the electoral process. They've been participating. I mean, I was talking about their ally, Sheikh Abdullah has been a stalwart in Kashmir, and he participated in the elections, and he's trusted the Indians. And there's his son, Farooq Abdullah, now Umar Abdullah, and there's Mahbooba Mufti. They've been participating in these elections. In the last election, there were these by-elections. I think the turnout was less than 6%, in certain instances less than 2%. And they do not have legitimacy, of course. Because what the Kashmiris are saying, that give us freedom, give us our choice, and we would participate in these elections. But these should not be elections to legitimize the illicit occupation of the territory. I hope I have been able to sort of analyze the dynamics in regard to your question.
Okay, I think that, thank you. As you can see, the panel gives us a detailed response, but as we are not pressed for time, we are being pressed for time? Okay, at 2:30, okay. Right, so I think that I will sum up at the end, but we will take one round of questions again. Please keep your questions brief, so that, and my request to the panelists to do the same. So I'll start from this side now. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, my question is, Mr. President has elaborated here that we are independent in Azad Jammu and Kashmir.
We are free.
Free or independent, yes. I would request him to please explain to the audience what sort of independence this is. We have land officers there. None of our civil servants can promote to IGP position, to Chief Secretary, to Auditor General, and then to Finance Secretary or whatever. Number two, our resources. We produce, at the moment we are producing about 2,000 megawatt of electricity in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. And our need for whole of Azad Kashmir is just 350 megawatts. And we are having 12 to 14 hours load shedding in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. So why our resources are being exploited like this, and then foreign exchange, and there are loads of things. And another thing about our independence, our freedom. Baba Jan, one of the political activists, he is imprisoned for 40 years, and his companions. And what was their crime? They were just fighting for the compensation of Attaabad Jheel, which was created there, and Pakistan have imprisoned them for 40 years. Imagine, we are living in an independent society. What sort of independence this is? And the final thing is, we, the people of Jammu and Kashmir, it's not like that we don't have talent or we are not able to serve the country.
We only have 5 minutes left in this venue. We have to take other questions.
Speeches.
Yes, okay. But so the last point?
The last point here. The last point is we here, if we can become ministers here and secretaries in Great Britain, why can't we serve our country in Jammu and Kashmir? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The person there, yes, you.
Thank you. First of all, can I congratulate the Bradford Digital Festival for organising this event?
We have little time.
Okay. My question is about the youth actually. My message is, what message would you give the panel, the youth, to get that movement? Look at what happened in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was there. How can we get this one about?
Message to the youth, the lady there, yes.
Could I just ask, what role do you see women playing in the future?
Okay, right. And the question from there, the lady there, yes.
Thank you. Kaniz Akhtar, can I just say that, first of all, I've listened very attentively to the panel and I've been extremely impressed of individual views. And I would really say and suggest this as something that we all need to take away from here today. I extremely welcome what the President has said so far about moving forward. I think until we change our narrative to look at what the key critical issue is in Jammu and Kashmir, which is the human atrocities, we will never move forward. But the question, sorry, if I can finish, the question I would like to ask is that how many of us, as UK citizens, are actually petitioning and lobbying our parliamentarians? We need to do a lot more because the issue cannot be resolved without.
Thank you. So the questions relate to resources, freedom, imprisonment, the changing narratives, youth, and women's role. You can pick and choose which one you want. So this time maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Khan.
Well, can I start? This very critical question from this gentleman. I hope that he was speaking on his behalf and not on somebody else's behalf. But if he was, let me tell you, then there are only 3 land officers. Let me also explain that there's a difference between independence and freedom. And I didn't say that Azad Kashmir was an independent state. Then we would have a seat in the United Nations, won't we? But we do not have that. And we are represented by Pakistan, or we are represented through Pakistan. So you have to understand the difference. There are only 3 land officers. And right now we have a chief secretary, we have our IG police, but we have our own Azad Kashmir's additional chief secretary. And our officers have reached the ultimate peak in bureaucratic level. They were given grade 22. Second, you talked about resources. Inshallah, Azad Kashmir will have plenty of resources. We're generating electricity. Right now, let me correct you, it is 1500 megawatt, not 2000, and our requirement is 400 megawatt, not 350. But let me tell you that in the next 5 years, we'll generate 5,000 to 6,000 megawatt electricity, and we would be self-sufficient, and we would be contributing to the national grid, and there's no compulsion about that. Let me also briefly women's role. There was somebody who asked a question about women's role.
Yes, Mr. Khan, if you could also respond to the present question, because I think that Sasha and others will also talk about the women's role.
Yeah.
The imprisonment of activists.
I'm not aware about it. I'll get the details and get back to you. But 40 years?
40. Yes. No, only Baba 11 more.
And 11 more. Okay, so he will think about it.
Women's role, you will finish with that?
Do you want to finish the point about women's role?
Well, very briefly, that in Azad Kashmir, let me inform you that women are doing better than men. And in the universities, when I go there and to the campuses, I'm the chancellor of the 5 universities there. Women outnumber and outperform boys. And let me tell you that when I went to a campus in Gimbar, 80% were girls. And when I give these certificates and awards for high performance, 80% are women. So there's a revolution going on there. And yes, I think there's also a question about the message, but let others give that message.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. A lot of questions. And we thought that we had more time, but we don't because fine. In terms of the, I'll also comment on the whole notion of all constitutions have their own peculiarity, including irrational elements. But I said the reason because AJK is an interim constitution also provides a model, right? And if the model itself has such a huge problem, two huge problems. One, that it denies one view, which is the independent view, forget the pro-independence view, that itself becomes a problem when in reality it's quite easy for the constitution to include that too. So for instance, by disenfranchising people who support freedom from both India and Pakistan in AJK, AJK becomes not even free. Now forget independent, not even free. That's the problem. A second, I mean, if Jammu and Kashmir has to be about people and the will of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, what message would AJK be sending through constitution when it says the president and the prime minister and the minister, everyone has to swear by particular God, right? That's the thing. Now in terms of Azadi, and I think it's crucial, the youth and the message, we have to work a lot in British. The key role that we can play is, first, while recognizing differences, do more to inspire people and specifically support young people, women and men both, there and sponsor, for instance, for their scholarships here. We can do that, not based on our ideology, but based on the fact that they have merit. We can do that. In terms of the role of women, it's very crucial. I mean, what's the point? I mean, how can anyone have Azadi if it doesn't including Azadi for women, doesn't including Azadi for sexual minorities, doesn't include Azadi for any kind of minority? So the notion of freedom that is patriarchal is, I'm sorry, but not a freedom, and that's how I like it. Thank you.
I think the role of young people is absolutely crucial, because I think when you look at the dialogue at the moment, it is led by older people who are very much entrenched in different views and different interests. So I think the young people are coming through with a much more neutral voice and a much more powerful voice and a voice very much embedded in that violence that they've witnessed and talking through an independent and talking about self-determination. So I think their role is absolutely crucial, where they're reaching out and learning to reach out, despite all the barriers that they have, they're learning to reach out to the international community for that support. So their role is absolutely crucial. I think for women, they're creating a narrative of stories, of the experiences of people on the ground, and the women are leading that absolutely in a way that's much more engaging and much more inviting for dialogue. And I think it moves away from this masculine solutions of oppression, of violence, of militarisation. I think women have a much bigger role to play in terms of a peaceful solution towards them.
Thank you, Sasha. So I will just respond to the brief set of points as we close the panel. So I think that women's role in peace building is really crucial, but beyond even just women or minorities, I think the real challenge, as as a gentleman there pointed out, is how to decolonize our minds. You are yourself. Each one of us is ourselves. And we know what our constraints and what are the problems we face and what our freedoms are. But it's always about empathy. If you were not you, would you still feel as free? Would you still feel as able to reach your potential? Would you still feel as constrained? So the question is, how do you decolonize your mind? And in that, this whole, the idea of basically an imperial sensibility is about assuming moral superiority, assuming economic rationality. And Britain did it, India does it, Pakistan does it, the official, the bureaucrat who makes the little guy or the little person, the little girl run around does it. It's that kind of imperialism is not just about territories, it's about a mindset that assumes I'm morally superior, I know what's rational. And that, undoing that, requires us to decolonize our minds, while at the same time, when, as they say, those who do not move do not notice their change. So until and unless there is friction, we don't realize what the constraints are. The very important issues about resources, about freedoms, about dissent, about media, they keep coming up in all of what one might imagine as Kashmir and of who one might imagine as Kashmiris. And it's our challenge. How do we deal with them in a world where democracy itself the idea of democracy is imploding very significantly in large parts of the world? So the question really is, when it's not that people, if you have a 2%, 3% vote, is that somebody who's elected and representative, but then if the other option is one of weapons, gentlemen, could you please let me complete? I'm the chair of the panel here.
I've been trying to actually say that the language being spoken here is not for moving it towards peaceful views.
I understand that, I appreciate there are many people who did not get to say their point of view, but as an academic activist, a Kashmiri, and as somebody deeply committed to the cause of Kashmiri people of all kinds who does not speak in communal terms, I am very keen that it be emphasized that differences are not the problem. The fact that she and him and you and someone else have different stories is important. What's important is not to other the person who disagrees with you, and to be able to sort of have that dialogue. If we can't do this in a room, if we can't do this in a constituency, how on earth are we going to do that in a territory of like millions of people? So with that, thank you everyone for being here. Please remember that it is important to continue this struggle on a humanist basis and to understand that these oppressions and injustices matter. Thank you.